when you see this sign, you're probably thinking of Spanish, right? But as many of you will already know, this sign is used everywhere in Portuguese. It usually comes over an A, but it's present in many common names like João. It's present in many common nouns, mai, irmão, cursal. There are so many, I couldn't even list them here easily. And even though Spanish and Portuguese are the two Romance languages that we most often see the sign in, they're not the only ones that this sign historically appeared in. For example, here's the first page from Alvise Cornaro's Trattato della Vita Sobria, which was written in 1560 in Venice. So we have evidence that at least in early modern Italian as spoken in Venice, this symbol was a copyist's, it was a printer's convention. And when we see a trait that's shared by so many different languages that are so closely related, it's reasonable to posit a common origin. And sure enough, there is one. And I might as well mention here that Native Lang has done a very good video on this already, and you'll find the link in the description. I strongly recommend you watch it because he's explored this question in depth as it relates to the Spanish language. It's very interesting. But today I want to look a little bit more at its application in Portuguese. So you'll pardon a tiny bit of history before we move on there. So firstly, this is a copyist's convention. It's called a tilde. In English, that comes from the Spanish word tilde, which itself is a derivation of the Latin titulus. So it literally means a small title. And I mentioned, of course, that it's a copyist's convention. And we have to talk a little bit about that. So for those of us who remember, there was a time before printing, right? There was a time when if you wanted another version of a document, it had to be copied out by hand. And this is something that we see many people dedicate themselves to in late antiquity, during antiquity, of course, as well, but especially during the Middle Ages with the rise of monastic culture. And I wasn't quite able to, in my research, figure out when exactly the first instance of this particular symbol comes about. So if anyone is able to date it before the Middle Ages, I'd be very grateful to see that in the comments. But from my understanding, we really see this convention arise in the Middle Ages after the monastic orders begin in earnest. And medieval monks had as part of their rule often, part of their community rule, to spend hours daily copying out these precious texts of ancient literature and philosophy, which of course indicates that we're not talking about the Dark Ages here, right? But of course, what happens if you have to copy things is that you get quite tired of writing them down, right? So if you don't have an easy typewriting technology and you have to manually copy everything, you're going to find shortcuts. And one of those shortcuts was to put this little symbol, this tilde in, which indicated that there was a missing letter. Now, from what I can see of the Roman scribal tradition, that missing letter was almost always an N. And if you look closely at the sign, you can see that it's sort of like a shortened and elongated, stretched out end itself, right? So usually when it's put there, it's a sign that there's an N in the word that is missing, that's being replaced by the symbol. And if we get back to Portuguese, that can help us get an idea of how any particular word used to be spelt. And this is particularly useful if you're a Portuguese student who's learning Spanish or vice versa. Because when we add that N in to a lot of the words that have the tilde in Portuguese, suddenly they make a lot more sense to us. Look at the name João. Okay, that's John in English. But the Latin form was Johannes. And if you put that N in, João, it suddenly becomes something like Joanu. Okay, that seems a lot more like the Johannes of Latin, right? And of course seems a lot more like the Juan in Spanish. Irmão was probably the best example of this that I can come up with off the top of my head, because suddenly if you put Irmão and you put the N in, it becomes Irmanu. And that sounds and looks a lot more like hermano in Spanish, right? So that is something that I find extremely useful. And what I like about doing this is that often understanding a language and being able to reconstruct the older way that its words used to appear, or may have appeared in a fully written out sentence, or fully written out form, helps us get an idea of the Romance languages as a continuum, right? We get to understand their commonalities. It makes learning the others a lot easier than harder, right? For anyone, for example, just as an anecdote, for anyone who's interested in learning multiple Romance languages, I strongly recommend, if you get a chance, to read El Cantar de mi Cid, because El Cid, when I read it, was really interesting. It's written in medieval Castilian, but because it's written in, if you may allow me to simplify, an older form of Spanish, it actually has a lot of word forms and syntactical forms that are conserved in other Romance languages but no longer exist in Spanish. I can't think of an exact example here, but maybe if any of you do, I'd like to hear in the comments below. As always, thank you very much for watching. You will notice that I've probably made many gaps in my research, many errors there, so I always appreciate you guys correcting me in the comments. Really, I've learned so much from your input over these past few months, so fire away. And then I thought I'd finish off with a brief comment on local weather. So I like recording all of my videos outside because it feels a lot more natural and it's just a lot nicer. But we have had one of the worst summers in history here in Johannesburg. And for those of you who are international audience members, and there are quite a few of you now, you should know that we probably have the best weather in the world in Johannesburg. I do believe that. Maybe I'm a bit biased. I am a bit biased. But to give you an example, in summer, it's usually warm, it's hot, not particularly humid, and always towards the afternoon we get a brief thunderstorm that cools everything down towards the evening. So we never really have particularly hot evenings. In winter, it's cold, of course. It's very, very cold. I mean, South Africa is at quite a high altitude, so there's very little humidity. The air is very thin, and so you feel the winter a lot more. But the most beautiful thing is that the sun shines constantly. So in South Africa, or rather in Johannesburg, we get almost year-round sunshine. And it's amazing. So that means that we are not used to this kind of weather. If you look here a little bit, and the camera is going to struggle a little bit, I think, but if you look what you can see up there, that is, by our standards, a very horrible, grey, overcast sky. And it's been like this for the whole summer, which is really disappointing, because I actually really like the sun. And I think it's psychologically affecting a lot of us. But anyway, I thought I'd finish off with that little anecdote about local life. If you are not enjoying this weather and you happen to be from Joburg, give me your thoughts below. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm not appreciating all the rain we've had. But anyway, until next video, goodbye.